My son took me to the doctor to prove I'd lost my mind. He wanted to lock me up and take everything I'd earned my entire life. He didn't know that I had spent months pretending to be weak just to lure him into this trap. And the doctor he so carefully chose. 40 years ago, he was pulling bullets out of me. Today, he'll help me pull a snake out of my own house. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. Have you ever played a role so well you started to forget who you really were? I asked myself that question every morning. My day began long before the sun, in the cool, quiet sanctuary of my basement workshop. Down there, my name was Frank, and I was 75 years old. But more than that, I was a mechanical engineer, a man who had spent a lifetime understanding the elegant, immutable laws of physics and precision. The air smelled of machine oil, sawdust, and the sharp, clean scent of metal. Every tool on the pegboard wall had its place, a silver and black constellation of order. Wrenches and calipers hung in descending size. Screwdrivers stood in their slots like disciplined soldiers. This was my world, a place of logic and control. My current project, the restoration of an antique German clockwork automaton, sat on my workbench. Its intricate brass gears and levers were exposed, a beautiful complex puzzle that I was methodically solving. My hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were steady as I used a pair of fine-tipped tweezers to set a tiny escapement lever. In this space, my mind was as clear and as sharp as it had been 40 years ago. It was a well-oiled machine, and it was running perfectly. This workshop was my reality. Everything upstairs was the stage. After an hour of focused work, I would begin my transformation. I cleaned my hands with a rough cloth, wiping away the oil of my real life, and ascended the wooden stairs into the house above. The house was quiet, a museum of my long life with my late wife, filled with furniture we had chosen together, and the ghosts of 1,000 shared breakfasts. But now, it was a theater of operations. I walked to the hall mirror and began my preparations. I deliberately ruffled my neatly combed silver hair. I loosened my collar and put on a cardigan with a small coffee stain on the cuff that I had intentionally left there. I practiced the look in my eyes, letting them go slightly unfocused, cloudy with a manufactured confusion. The final touch was a subtle tremor in my right hand, a slight, intermittent shake that I had perfected over weeks of practice. I would sit in my armchair in the living room, the one with the worn floral pattern, and wait for the sound of my son's key in the lock. David arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, as he always did, carrying a bag of groceries that was both a token of his care and a symbol of my supposed incompetence. His entrance was always the same, a heavy put-upon sigh as he closed the door, the sound of a man burdened by duty. He saw me in the chair and put on his patient, patronizing smile. His very presence was a performance, a carefully constructed role of the devoted son managing his declining father. He did not know that he was the one being managed. The day's performance began. I rose to my feet with a theatrical slowness, my joints seemingly stiff, and went to help him with the groceries. He protested gently, a gesture that was part of our script. I insisted, my expression one of feeble determination. I took a carton of milk from the bag and turned toward the refrigerator, my path deliberately taking me too close to the coffee mug he had placed on the counter. My trembling hand brushed against it. The mug tipped, and a wave of dark brown liquid cascaded onto the clean white floor. For a moment, I looked down at the mess with wide, childlike eyes, my mouth slightly agape in a mask of bewildered apology. David let out another, longer sigh, this one a mix of frustration and pity. He took the milk from my hand, his touch gentle but firm, the way one would handle an unpredictable child, and sat me back down in my chair while he cleaned the floor. I watched him, my face a study in vacant regret. Inside, my engineer's mind was a flurry of calculations, observing, analyzing. The pity in his eyes was genuine. The frustration was real. The bait was working perfectly. Later, as he was putting away the last of the items, he mentioned a name, a neighbor from across the street. I looked at him, my head tilted in a pantomime of trying to access a corrupted file. I let a few seconds of silence pass, then asked who he was talking about. I had known that man, Bill, for 40 years. We had built the fence between our houses together. David's face softened with that familiar, sad pity. He explained who Bill was, slowly, using small words, as if the memory could be coaxed back into my failing mind. I watched the condescension in his posture, the weary sense of superiority. And I saw his eyes drift, just for a second, to the heavy, silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece, then to the antique grandfather clock, my own creation, that stood in the corner. He was not just seeing a deteriorating father. He was taking inventory. He left just before noon, his duty for the day fulfilled. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a final patronizing pat. He reminded me to take my medication, his voice slow and loud. I nodded meekly, my eyes unfocused. The moment I heard the sound of his car pulling away from the curb, the performance ended. The tremor in my hand ceased. The vacant look in my eyes sharpened into a clear, focused intelligence. I stood up, my movements no longer slow and frail, but efficient and precise. I went to the kitchen, and with a damp cloth, meticulously wiped the last sticky traces of coffee from the floor. Then I descended back into the quiet, logical sanctuary of my workshop. I picked up my tweezers and returned to the intricate clockwork on my bench. The role was demanding, and at times I did feel a flicker of the confusion I was feigning. But then I would look at the beautiful, orderly world of gears and levers in front of me, and I would remember exactly who I was and exactly what I was doing. What does it sound like when a trap is finally sprung? It is not the violent, metallic snap of a bear trap closing on a limb. It is not the loud crack of a deadfall. It is a much quieter sound. It is the rustle of glossy paper, the soft, placating tone of a familiar voice, and the almost imperceptible click of a final puzzle piece sliding into its designated place. It is a sound of profound and terrible quiet. For a week I had continued my performance, a meticulous and draining exercise in self-erasure. I had become a ghost in my own home, a creature of mild confusion and harmless accidents. I had calibrated my decline with the precision of an engineer, offering my son, David, a steady and believable stream of data points to support the conclusion he so desperately wanted to reach. The tremor in my hand was now a familiar companion, the vacant look in my eyes a second skin. I had built my own cage of senility, and I was waiting for him to lock the door. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in the house was stale and warm, the television murmuring a low-budget courtroom drama in the background. I was in my armchair, pretending to doze, my head tilted at an angle of weary collapse. David, who had been pacing the room, his phone occasionally buzzing with an impatient message, finally came to a decision. I felt the shift in his energy, the transition from anxious planning to decisive action. He picked up the remote and the television fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was a signal, a clearing of the stage for the main event. He walked over to my chair and knelt beside it, a gesture that was meant to be one of intimacy and care, but which felt like a predator assessing its cornered prey. His face was a careful construction of gentle concern. He was holding a brochure, printed on thick, expensive paper. He held it out for me to see. On the front, a handsome, silver-haired doctor was smiling benevolently, and below him, the words, "Dr. Robert Marcus, a new approach to geriatric health and wellness." I let my eyes drift over the page, my expression one of vague, pleasant interest. Inside, I felt a surge of cold, electric triumph. The trap, so carefully designed, had been armed and placed by the target himself. David began his presentation, his voice soft and reasonable. He pointed to the picture, to the impressive list of credentials, to the serene, sun-drenched photographs of the clinic. He was selling me a solution to a problem I had invented. He was a master of his own self-deception, utterly convinced of his noble intentions. The sound of the trap springing was the sound of my oldest friend's name on my son's lips. Dr. Marcus. As David spoke, my mind, for a fraction of a second, left the quiet, sunlit living room and traveled back 40 years. I was in a different kind of heat, a humid, suffocating jungle heat, the air thick with the smell of mud and antiseptic. I was lying on a stretcher, my side a blaze of white-hot fire, and a younger version of the man in the photograph was leaning over me, his face grim with focus, his hands moving with a speed and a certainty that defied the chaos all around us. He had been a medic then, a boy of 25 with the steady hands of a surgeon and the eyes of a man who had seen too much. The memory was as sharp and clear as a piece of shrapnel. He had saved my life then, and now he was going to help me save it again. I pulled my mind back to the present. The surge of memory was gone, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a soldier executing a plan. I had to play my part to perfection. I looked at the brochure, my feigned tremor making the paper shake slightly in my hand. I let my eyes linger on the picture of the doctor, and I allowed a look of faint, foggy recognition to cross my face. The look of a man trying to grasp a memory that keeps slipping away. I was giving David exactly what he wanted to see, a mind in its final, chaotic retreat. He saw my expression, and his own face softened with further pity and self-satisfaction. My confusion was the ultimate confirmation of his rightness. I looked from the brochure up to my son's earnest, waiting face. He was waiting for my assent, the final piece he needed to move forward. He had laid out his case with such care, with such a performance of filial duty. My role was simple. I had to submit. I had to be the confused, trusting, and ultimately helpless father who would place his fate in the hands of his capable son. I let a small, uncertain smile touch my lips. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that conveyed a world of weary resignation, I nodded. It was a simple gesture, a slight inclination of the head, but it was the most powerful move I had made in months. It was the signal that set the final phase of the operation in motion. It was the key, turning in the lock. A wave of profound relief washed over David's face. The tension he had been holding in his shoulders disappeared. He had done it. He had convinced the old man. He gently took the brochure from my hand and placed it on the end table, his movements now light and cheerful. He patted my hand, a gesture of final, dismissive ownership. He stood up, the dutiful son, his difficult task now complete. He left a few minutes later, after promising to call with the details of the appointment. I listened to the sound of the front door closing, the sound of his car starting, the sound of it all fading into the quiet of the afternoon. I sat motionless in my chair for a long time. Then I leaned forward, my hand perfectly steady, and picked up the brochure. I looked at the smiling, professional photograph of my old army medic. The trap had been sprung, and the prey had no idea he was already caught. How do you fight a battle when your best strategy is to pretend to surrender? This was the question that governed my every waking moment in the days that followed. The appointment with my old friend, the good Dr. Marcus, was set for the following week. That gave me 7 days. 7 days to reinforce the narrative, to cement my son's conviction, and to resist the powerful instinctual urge to drop the mask and fight back. This period was the most critical phase of the operation, a time for absolute discipline. The call was not a summons to adventure, but a constant internal siren song urging me to reclaim my dignity, to rage against the injustice of my son's intentions. And my refusal of that call was my primary, all-consuming task. I escalated my performance. My carefully calibrated decline became a more pronounced, undeniable state of decay. One morning, while David was visiting, I went to the kitchen to make toast and instead placed a plate in the toaster, looking on with mild bovine confusion as it failed to fit. I endured his exasperated lecture on appliance safety with a look of chastened bewilderment. Another afternoon, I took to watering the artificial ficus tree in the living room, a slow and deliberate stream of water that pooled on the hardwood floor before David rushed over to stop me, his voice a tight coil of frustration and pity. Each of these small theatrical acts was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of evidence around him, a prison of his own assumptions. I watched him as he watched me, his expression shifting over the week from mere concern to a hardened, grim certainty. He was no longer just my son. He had become my keeper, my warden, and he was growing more confident in the role with every passing day. The temptation to break, to answer the call to fight, was immense. It came in moments of quiet cruelty. He began speaking about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right in front of him. On a phone call with his wife, his voice low but not low enough, I heard him describe my latest fabricated blunder, his tone not one of sorrow, but of a man cataloging the final, annoying faults of a malfunctioning machine he was about to replace. In that moment, a hot, white flash of anger roared through me. The old Frank, the sergeant, the engineer, the man who had faced down far greater threats with cold fury, wanted to rise from the chair, to grab the phone, to unleash a torrent of clear, articulate rage that would shatter my son's smug condescension. This was the call, the primal urge to defend, to attack, to correct the record with force, but I refused it. With the discipline forged in the jungles and honed over a lifetime of engineering problems, I pushed the anger down. I analyzed the situation with cold, dispassionate logic. An outburst would achieve nothing. It would be my word against his. It would be seen as a sudden, aggressive episode, further proof of my mental instability. He would adapt, change his strategy, become more cautious. No, the current plan was superior. It was a strategic retreat, a feigned surrender designed to lure an overconfident enemy into a perfectly prepared ambush. In the Army, we learned that the most effective trap is the one the enemy walks into willingly, believing it to be a path to safety and victory. David believed he was walking the path to his inheritance. He had no idea he was marching directly into a court-monitored kill zone, with my oldest and most trusted brother-in-arms waiting to spring the trap. The morning of the appointment arrived, a crisp, clear autumn day. David arrived earlier than usual, a man on a mission. He had laid out my clothes for me, a simple drab pair of trousers and a faded polo shirt, the uniform of the institutionalized elderly. I allowed him to dress me as one would a child, my feigned helplessness a bitter pill to swallow. I felt a profound sense of humiliation as his fingers fumbled with the buttons on my shirt, but I masked it with a look of placid indifference. This was the final piece of my surrender, the ultimate act of ceding control that would cement his belief in his own dominance. The drive to the clinic was silent. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands resting limply in my lap, and stared out the window with my practiced, vacant expression. David hummed along softly with the radio, a man entirely at ease, confident that his troubles were almost over. He was in the driver's seat, in every sense of the word. But I was the one who had drawn the map for this journey. As we drove, I fortified myself with a memory. It was not of my wife, or my son as a boy, but of Marcus. A memory of a monsoon-drenched night in a makeshift field hospital, the air thick with the smell of blood and rain. A young soldier was on the table, his life draining away, and a piece of equipment had failed. I remembered working by the dim light of a failing generator, my hands covered in grease and gore, to repair the delicate mechanism of the surgical pump, while Marcus, with an impossible calm, kept the boy alive with his bare hands. We had not needed words. There was a complete and total trust between us, an understanding forged in the crucible of chaos. He had trusted my engineering, and I had trusted his medicine. It was that same trust that formed the foundation of the plan we were about to execute. We pulled into the parking lot of the medical complex. David found a spot close to the entrance, a final small kindness for the frail man he believed me to be. He turned off the engine, and the car was filled with a quiet, final sense of purpose. He turned to me, a last pitying smile on his face, the look of a man about to perform a sad but necessary duty. I met his smile with one of my own, a faint, watery, and utterly meaningless expression. My refusal was complete. I had not fought. I had not argued. I had surrendered my way to the battlefield, and my general was waiting inside. Have you ever walked into a room where you were the only one who knew the truth? The truth, I have found, is a heavy thing to carry alone. It has a weight and a density that can feel like a lead vest strapped to your soul. But it is also a shield, an invisible armor that allows you to stand firm when the entire world is trying to tell you that you are someone you are not. I felt the full weight of that shield as I allowed my son, David, to guide me into the sterile, quiet world of the medical clinic. The waiting room was a carefully curated space of beige tranquility. The walls were painted a soft, unoffensive shade of cream. The art was a series of bland, mass-produced prints of sailboats and seascapes. The chairs were arranged in neat, impersonal rows, their cushions firm and unforgiving. The air itself smelled of rubbing alcohol and the faint floral scent of an air freshener that was fighting a losing battle. It was a room designed to be forgotten, a place of anxious neutrality where people waited for verdicts. David led me to a chair as if I were a fragile piece of glass, his hand on my elbow overly solicitous, his movement slow and exaggerated for the benefit of the young woman behind the reception desk. He was performing, and he was a natural. He was playing the role of the devoted, long-suffering son, a man burdened by the sad but necessary duty of caring for his declining father. I, in turn, played my part. I allowed myself to be guided, my steps shuffling and uncertain. I sat where I was told, my expression a carefully blank mask of pleasant confusion. I looked around the room with a wide-eyed, childlike wonder, as if I had never seen a potted plant or a stack of magazines before. Our two performances, so different in their intent, meshed together perfectly, creating a single, cohesive, and utterly false narrative. The receptionist slid a clipboard with a stack of forms toward him. This was a crucial part of the plan, the creation of the official record. I watched as David took a seat beside me and began to write. His pen moved with a brisk, confident authority. I could see the questions from the corner of my eye, the small boxes he was ticking with such certainty. Memory loss, frequent. Disorientation, yes. Difficulty with daily tasks, yes. Agitation or mood swings, occasional. He was a forger, painting a portrait of my decay with clean, decisive strokes. He was building his case, document by document, lie by lie. I felt a surge of cold, dispassionate anger, the anger of an engineer watching someone use a precision instrument as a blunt weapon. But I suppressed it. My role required passivity. I leaned my head back against the wall, closed my eyes, and let out a soft, contented sigh, as if I were a simple old man enjoying a brief, unthinking rest. Inside, my mind was a whirlwind of activity, recording every detail, every checkmark, every nuance of his performance. He finished the paperwork and returned it to the desk, speaking to the receptionist in a low, conspiratorial whisper, his hand gesturing towards me with a sad shake of his head. He was reinforcing the story, ensuring the staff saw what he wanted them to see. He then returned to his seat and picked up a magazine, settling in for the wait. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustle of his pages and the ticking of a large, plain clock on the wall. Each tick was a countdown, a step closer to the next phase. I continued my own performance. I reached for a magazine on the table in front of me, a glossy journal on architecture. My trembling hand fumbled with the slick pages. I opened it and held it in my lap, my eyes tracing the lines of a blueprint for a modern skyscraper. For a long moment, I held it upside down. I saw David glance over at me, a flicker of smug pity in his eyes, before he returned to his own reading. I then, with a look of dawning, foolish realization, slowly and carefully turned the magazine right side up. The nurse appeared at the doorway, a file in her hand. She called my name, her voice soft and professionally kind. David immediately stood up, placing a hand on my shoulder to gently rouse me. I looked up at him, my eyes blinking with feigned surprise, as if I had been woken from a deep sleep. He helped me to my feet, his grip once again firm and proprietary. The walk from the waiting room, down a long, sterile hallway, was the crossing of the threshold. The beige walls were lined with more generic art and medical posters explaining the complexities of the human nervous system. We were walking toward the office of a man who was about to judge the state of my own. David walked beside me, his hand never leaving my arm, his presence a constant, condescending weight. He thought he was leading me to a final, formal diagnosis of my end. He had no idea he was escorting me to the beginning of his. The nurse stopped before a closed door and gave a soft knock. We waited. I could hear the faint sound of movement from within. Then, the door opened. And there he was. Dr. Robert Marcus. He was older, of course, his hair now a distinguished silver, his face lined with the quiet authority of his profession. He wore a white coat and had a stethoscope draped around his neck. He looked every bit the part my son had cast for him. But as he stood there, his eyes, the same sharp, intelligent eyes I remembered from a lifetime ago, moved from David's face to my own. For 1/10 of a second, an eternity in a moment of such high stakes, he was not a doctor looking at a new patient. He was a medic looking at his sergeant. I saw it. I saw the flash of recognition, the memory of mud and blood and shared, unspoken trust. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a mask of warm, professional concern. It was the most brilliant piece of acting I had ever seen. He extended a hand to my son, a polite and welcoming gesture. David, completely blind to the silent, powerful exchange that had just occurred, stepped forward to shake it. I had walked into a room where I was the only one who knew the truth. Now I was no longer alone. My ally was in position. The threshold was crossed. The trap was set. What is it like to listen to your own obituary, written by your own son? It is like being a ghost at your own funeral. You are present, but you are unseen. You are the subject of every word, yet you have no voice. You are forced to watch as a stranger, who happens to wear your son's face, constructs a false effigy of you, piece by piece, and presents it to the world as fact. It is a slow, methodical erasure, a death by 1,000 qualifications, and my greatest test was to sit through it all with the placid, agreeable expression of a man who did not even realize he was being buried. The office of Dr. Robert Marcus was a fortress of quiet professionalism. The walls were paneled in a dark, reassuring mahogany. The chairs were upholstered in a soft black leather that sighed as you sat down. On the wall behind his large, orderly desk hung his credentials, a series of framed diplomas from prestigious universities. But next to them, in a smaller, simpler frame, was another certificate. It was a unit commendation, awarded to the 17th Combat Support Hospital for service during a campaign 40 years ago. A campaign whose mud I could still sometimes feel on my boots. It was a quiet signal, a small flag planted in this sterile civilian world to remind me that I was on friendly ground. My ally was in position. I sat in one of the leather chairs, my back deliberately slumped, my hands resting nervously on my knees. David, my son, my enemy, sat in the other, leaning forward with an air of earnest gravity. He was the picture of a concerned son, his brow furrowed with a well-rehearsed sadness. Dr. Marcus sat behind his desk, a model of professional empathy. He gave my son a gentle, encouraging nod, a silent invitation to begin. And so, the eulogy began. David started with the small things, the twisted truths. He recounted the incident with the spilled coffee, describing it not as a simple, clumsy accident, but as a symptom of a dangerous disconnect from reality. He spoke of the toast in the plate incident, embellishing it until it sounded like a full-blown psychotic break with the fundamental laws of kitchen appliances. I listened, my face a mask of mild confusion, as he took the carefully planted seeds of my performance and cultivated them into a monstrous garden of pathology. Inside, my engineer's mind was a cold, silent fact-checker, noting the exaggerations, the misinterpretations, the deliberate framing of each event to support his single, unalterable conclusion. From there, he moved on to outright fabrication. He spoke of nights he had supposedly been called over because I had wandered out of the house, confused and lost. He described a fictional paranoid episode in which I had accused the mailman of stealing my newspapers. As he wove these tales, his voice took on a tone of deep, sorrowful resignation. He was not just a son, he was a martyr, a saint of filial piety, patiently enduring the unpredictable and frightening behavior of a mind in its twilight. It was a masterful performance. He may have even convinced himself it was true. I watched him, and I felt a flicker of something akin to professional respect for the sheer audacity of his lies. It was overshadowed, however, by a deep, chilling sorrow. The boy I had taught to value precision and honesty had grown into this stranger, a man who could so easily and so skillfully build a world out of falsehoods. The most difficult part of the test was when he turned to my life's work. He described my workshop, my sanctuary of order and precision, as a cluttered and dangerous fire hazard. He spoke of my ongoing projects, the intricate work of restoring beautiful old machines, as aimless tinkering with junk. He was not just attacking my memory, he was attacking my identity, my very essence. He was invalidating my entire life, dismissing it as the obsessive, pointless hobby of a man who had lost his grip. In that moment, the ghost in the chair felt a surge of rage. I wanted to stand up, to speak of the beauty of a perfectly balanced gear train, to explain the elegant mathematics of a spring-loaded escapement, to defend the honor of the logical, beautiful world I had inhabited. But I did not. I simply let my head droop a little further, my expression becoming one of shame, as if I were a child being reprimanded for making a mess. Throughout this long, painful monologue, I watched my ally. Marcus was perfect. He listened with an unwavering, patient focus. He nodded in all the right places, his expression a careful blend of sympathy and clinical interest. He made notes on a legal pad, his pen scratching quietly, the sound a steady counterpoint to my son's voice. But I saw the things David did not. I saw the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when David described my fictional wanderings. I saw the way his pen pressed a little harder into the paper when my workshop was dismissed as a junk pile. And I saw, with a clarity that only a fellow soldier would recognize, the moment he executed a key maneuver. As he shifted some papers on his desk, his hand moved with a quiet, deliberate motion, and with a soft, nearly inaudible click, he activated the small digital voice recorder that sat next to his pen holder. The trap was now not only set, it was documented. Finally, David's testimony wound down. He sat back in his chair, a man emotionally exhausted from the sad but necessary task of laying his father's mind to rest. He had done his part. He had presented his case. He looked at the doctor, his eyes full of a hopeful, pleading expectation. He had handed this problem, this burden, over to a professional. The room fell silent. The obituary was finished. Marcus placed his pen down with quiet finality. He looked from David's face to my own confused and vacant expression, and then back to David. I had endured. I had passed the test. Now it was my ally's turn to speak. How much evidence does it take to bury a man alive? Not with a shovel and dirt, but with paper and ink, with carefully chosen words and the sympathetic, concerned expressions of those who stand to gain from your demise. I sat in the soft leather chair of my old friend's office and learned the answer. The room was quiet after my son, David, had finished his long, sorrowful litany of my supposed failings. The air was thick with the weight of his accusations. I watched Dr. Marcus. He did not speak. He simply made a final note on his legal pad, placed his pen down with quiet deliberation, and steepled his fingers, his gaze resting on my son with an expression of deep, clinical seriousness. It was a silent, powerful prompt. It invited David to continue, to move beyond the anecdotal and into the heart of his argument. It was a gesture that opened the door to the inmost cave, and David, brimming with self-assurance, walked right in. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a handsome leather briefcase onto his lap. The crisp, authoritative snap of the latch's opening echoed in the quiet room. This was a transition. He was no longer just the grieving son. He was now the capable, proactive manager, the man of business here to solve a difficult financial and logistical problem. The first documents he slid across the polished mahogany desk were my own bank and investment statements. He had organized them neatly with colored tabs. His finger, so different from my own calloused and oil-stained hands, traced a line of numbers. It was a series of modest withdrawals I had made over the past 2 months, funds I had used to retain a lawyer and to compensate Marcus for the considerable risk and time this operation required. He presented these withdrawals as evidence of erratic, inexplicable behavior. He framed them as a sign of my fiscal irresponsibility, a potential vulnerability to scams. He painted a picture of a man squandering his life's savings on whims, a man who needed to be protected from himself. I watched him, and I felt the cold, clean anger of a man who had spent a lifetime balancing budgets and planning for the future, being lectured on fiscal prudence by a son whose own financial desperation was the unspoken engine of this entire charade. Next came the brochures. They were glossy, trifold pamphlets, printed on heavy, expensive paper stock. The covers showed vibrant, silver-haired seniors laughing together on a sun-drenched lawn or playing chess in a wood-paneled library. The names were comforting and aspirational. Oakmont Senior Living, The Willows at Meadow Ridge. David spoke of them with a connoisseur's appreciation, pointing out the amenities, the heated indoor pool, the gourmet dining options, the full schedule of social activities. He presented them as a paradise, a final comfortable reward for a life well lived. I, however, saw the numbers. On the back of each brochure, a small, discreet fee schedule was printed. The cost per month was astronomical, a figure that would incinerate my entire estate in a matter of a few short years. This was not a plan to preserve my well-being. It was a plan to liquidate my assets with maximum efficiency. He wanted to place me in the most expensive, secure, and distant facility possible, a place where his financial obligations would be clear and his filial duties would be complete, leaving him free to inherit what was left. Then came the final exhibit, the true heart of the cave. He pulled a sheaf of papers, held together by a binder clip, from the last compartment of his briefcase. They were legal documents. He laid them on the desk with a quiet reverence, as if they were a sacred text. On top, I could read the title, printed in a severe official font, Durable Power of Attorney. My name was already typed neatly in all the required places. His name was listed as the sole agent. All it required was a formal declaration of my incompetence, signed by a licensed physician, and my own, coerced signature. It was the instrument of my civil death, the legal weapon that would transfer control of my life, my home, my finances, everything I had ever worked for, into his hands. He had come prepared not just to argue his case, but to close the deal. The premeditation of it, the cold, clinical efficiency, was breathtaking. Throughout this presentation, my performance was one of utter bewilderment. When he showed me the bank statements, I squinted at them with a look of profound, helpless confusion, as if the numbers were a foreign language. When he showed me the brochures, I looked at the pictures of the smiling seniors with a vague, pleasant emptiness, as if I were a child, looking at a picture book. And when he laid the power of attorney documents on the desk, I recoiled slightly, a flicker of feigned animal fear in my eyes, the reaction of a man who senses a threat, but no longer possesses the faculties to understand it. All the while, my ally played his part to perfection. Marcus examined each document with a detached, professional gravity. He held the bank statements up to the light. He asked David, with a simple questioning gesture, to clarify a particular detail in the nursing home fee structure. He picked up the power of attorney form and read through it, his face a complete and unreadable mask. He was drawing David further and further into the trap, letting him expose the full depth of his greed for the benefit of the small, silent recording device that was capturing every moment. The ordeal reached its peak when David, his presentation complete, gently pushed the power of attorney document across the desk toward Marcus. It was not an aggressive gesture, but an inviting one. It was the final, damning act of a son trying to recruit a respected doctor as his accomplice in the burial of his own father. The document sat in the center of the desk, a white flag of surrender he was trying to force upon me, but which was, in reality, the trigger for his own self-destruction. The air in the room was thick with a silent, terrible tension. Marcus did not move immediately. He simply looked at the papers, then at David's earnest, pleading face, and then, for a long, heavy moment, at me, the broken, confused old man slumped in the chair. The evidence had been presented. The cave had been entered. The treasure, my son's treachery, in all its legal and financial detail, had been revealed. Can you feel victory in the moment of your greatest feigned weakness? It is a strange and paradoxical sensation. It is the feeling of a soldier, deep behind enemy lines, disguised in the uniform of his foe. Every salute he is forced to give, every password he is forced to utter, is an act of submission on its surface, but in reality, it is a move of calculated aggression, a step deeper into the heart of the enemy's fortress. I sat in that leather chair, a fortress of a different kind, and prepared for the deepest and most humiliating phase of my infiltration. Dr. Marcus, my ally, my old friend, turned his full professional attention to me. The test, my final and most difficult ordeal, was about to begin. He began simply. He leaned forward, his expression one of gentle clinical kindness, the look of a doctor who had guided 1,000 worried patients through this process. He did not speak to me as a peer, but as a subject. He held up 2 fingers and looked at me with a patient, expectant gaze. The question was clear. I let my own eyes go slightly unfocused. I squinted, as if trying to resolve a blurry image. After a long, deliberate pause, I held up 3 of my own fingers, a look of uncertain pride on my face. I watched David, who sat a few feet away, a silent and smug spectator. I saw him share a small, sad glance with the doctor, a look that conveyed a world of shared understanding about my tragic decline. Marcus made a note on his pad, his face betraying nothing. He then pointed to the large calendar on his desk, tapping today's date, a Thursday. He looked at me again. I smiled a vague, pleasant smile, and with a voice that I made thin and reedy, I announced that it was Tuesday, a fine Tuesday. The ordeal continued, a slow, methodical dismantling of my feigned competence. Marcus named 3 simple, unrelated objects for me to remember: apple, table, penny. He had me repeat them once, which I did with the slow, labored concentration of a struggling child. Then he moved on. He checked my reflexes with a small rubber mallet, my leg kicking out with a satisfying, healthy jerk. He shone a light into my eyes, my pupils contracting with perfect, mechanical precision. My body, at least, was a traitor to the narrative of my decay. It was a well-maintained machine. But my mind was the weapon and the sacrifice. After a few minutes of physical checks, he returned to the memory test. He looked at me with that same patient kindness. I returned his gaze with a look of utter blank confusion. Apple, table, penny. The words were a steady, clear mantra in the silence of my own mind. But on the outside, I offered only a shrug, a helpless, apologetic smile. I had forgotten. I saw David's shoulders slump with a sigh of profound, theatrical sorrow. He had his proof. During these long, humiliating minutes, my eyes kept drifting to the wall behind Marcus's desk. I was not looking at the medical diplomas. I was looking at the small, dark frame beside them, at the unit commendation for the 17th Combat Support Hospital. And for a moment, the quiet, climate-controlled office would dissolve, replaced by the memory of the relentless, percussive sound of a monsoon rain hammering against a tin roof, the air thick with the smell of ozone and fear. I saw Marcus, decades younger, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a single bare bulb, working with a furious, focused calm to set a shattered bone. His commands to me sharp, precise, and unwavering. I was not his patient then. I was his sergeant, the engineer tasked with keeping the field hospital's generators and delicate equipment running in an impossible environment. We were a team, a two-man unit of precision and logic in a world of absolute chaos. That memory, the memory of our shared discipline under fire, was my anchor. It was the source of my strength. I was a soldier again, and this humiliation was a necessary part of the mission. This feigned weakness was my weapon. The final and most difficult part of the ordeal was the clock. Marcus placed a blank sheet of paper and a pen on the desk in front of me. With a gentle, encouraging gesture, he indicated that I should draw the face of a clock with all the numbers, and then set the hands to 10 minutes past 11. I picked up the pen. For a man who had spent a lifetime drafting complex schematics to the thousandth of an inch, a man whose hands understood the elegant perfection of a circle and the logical progression of numbers, this task was a form of exquisite torture. I had to force my own expert hand to betray a lifetime of training. My first attempt at the circle was a misshapen, lopsided oval. I made a show of frustratedly scribbling it out and starting again. The second circle was better, but still visibly flawed. Then came the numbers. I clustered them, small and spidery, on the right side of the circle, leaving a vast, empty expanse on the left. I mixed up the 6 and the 9, and then the hands. I drew the minute hand short and thick, pointing to the 2, and the hour hand long and thin, pointing vaguely toward the 8. It was a masterpiece of cognitive collapse, a perfect portrait of a mind that had lost its grasp on time, space, and logic. I pushed the paper back across the desk, my performance complete. I looked down at my own hands, as if ashamed of their betrayal. In that moment of my greatest, most perfectly executed weakness, a wave of pure, cold victory washed through me. The hook had been baited, the trap had been sprung, and now the final damning piece of evidence had been created. The ordeal was over. Marcus picked up the drawing, his expression unreadable. He looked at it for a long, silent moment, then placed it neatly on top of the power of attorney forms David had provided. He closed the file folder, the soft sound of cardboard on cardboard signaling the end of the examination. He then turned his calm, professional gaze to my son, a doctor ready to deliver his considered, expert opinion. What is the sound of absolute certainty? It is not a trumpet blast or a chorus of voices. It is a profound and total silence, the quiet that descends after a complex machine, years in the making, has been switched on and is now running its course with flawless, inexorable precision. It is the sound of a plan in perfect motion. I sat slumped in the leather chair, a portrait of pathetic decline, and listened to the beautiful, terrible sound of my son's world beginning to unravel. The room was still, suspended in the moment after I had handed my terribly drawn clock back to Dr. Marcus. The final piece of evidence had been submitted. My ordeal was over. Now the reward was at hand. Marcus, my oldest and most trusted friend, held the drawing, his expression one of deep professional gravity. He looked at it for a long, quiet moment, then placed it carefully on top of the other documents David had provided: the bank statements, the brochures, the power of attorney form. He squared the edges of the pile with his fingertips, a small, precise gesture of a man bringing order to chaos. He then leaned back in his chair, a soft sigh escaping his lips. It was a sigh of clinical weariness, of a doctor burdened by a difficult diagnosis, and it was a perfect piece of theater. He looked at my son, not at me, and slowly, gravely, shook his head. I watched David's face. He leaned forward, his body taut with anticipation, ready to receive the verdict that would unlock his future. Marcus began his assessment, his voice a low, measured, and deeply compassionate murmur. He did not use simple or alarmist words. He spoke the cold, clinical language of his profession, a language that carried an unshakable weight of authority. He spoke of significant cognitive impairment, of impaired executive function, and a clear degradation of spatio-temporal reasoning, the last a direct reference to my disastrous attempt at drawing the clock. Each phrase was a carefully chosen nail, hammered one by one into the coffin of my legal competence. He painted a picture of a man whose mind was no longer a reliable instrument, a man who had, through no fault of his own, become a danger to himself and his own best interests. As Marcus spoke, I saw a wave of pure, unadulterated relief wash over my son's face. The tension he had been holding in his shoulders for weeks, for months, simply dissolved. He sat back in his chair, the rigid posture of the concerned son replaced by the relaxed, expansive posture of a man whose long, difficult gamble had just paid off. He even managed to produce a look of profound sorrow, his eyes misting over as he shook his head in a pantomime of grief. He was mourning the father he had just successfully condemned, a performance of such breathtaking hypocrisy that it was almost beautiful in its perfection. He had won. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he had won. Then came the masterstroke. This was the true reward, the elegant and deadly heart of our entire operation. Marcus paused, looking at David with a new level of seriousness. He explained that his professional diagnosis, while clear and unambiguous in his own mind, was just the first step. For a matter as serious as assuming power of attorney and arranging for long-term residential care, a simple doctor's note would not be sufficient. There were, he explained, legal protocols that had to be followed to the letter to protect everyone involved. He then proposed the solution. He would recommend, in the strongest possible terms, a formal competency hearing before a probate court judge. He would submit his detailed medical report, including my failed cognitive tests, as primary evidence. Furthermore, he would offer to testify in person, under oath, as an expert medical witness on my behalf, or rather, on behalf of my son's petition. It was a work of art. He was using the very legal system David had intended to use against me, and was framing it as the final, necessary step to ensure my son's victory. He was offering to place the full, unimpeachable weight of his professional and moral authority behind David's fraudulent claim. He was not just giving my son a diagnosis, he was handing him a loaded gun on a silver platter, assuring him that it was the only way to win the war. The beauty of the trap was its perfection. David, consumed by his greed and his own sense of intellectual superiority, could not possibly see it for what it was. My son's face lit up with a look of avaricious glee that he quickly tried to mask with an expression of solemn gratitude. He accepted the doctor's proposal with a fervent, eager nod. This was beyond his wildest dreams. He had not just found a pliable doctor, he had found a powerful, proactive ally who would walk him through the final legal hurdles and guarantee his success. The sound of absolute certainty, I realized, was the sound of my son's quiet, heartfelt expression of thanks to the man who was about to utterly destroy him. It was the sound of his complete and total belief in a fiction we had so carefully constructed. In my mind, I felt a profound, quiet sense of victory, as clean and as satisfying as solving a complex engineering problem. The machine we had built was working perfectly. The appointment concluded with a handshake, a firm man-to-man gesture of agreement between my son and my oldest friend. Dr. Marcus then turned to me and gave my shoulder a gentle, pitying pat, the final perfect touch to his flawless performance. David then helped me to my feet, his touch now proprietary, the touch of a man handling his most valuable, if most troublesome, asset. He led me from the office, his step light and confident. He was a triumphant general leading his captive from the field of battle. He had no idea that he was the one who was the prisoner, and that he had just willingly and gratefully walked into the center of his own execution chamber. What does a predator look like when he thinks he has won? He does not snarl or bare his teeth. He does not stalk his territory with a menacing gait. No, the predator who is certain of his victory looks magnanimous. He becomes a creature of performative generosity and benevolent calm. He purrs. He is all soft paws and gentle affections. His dominance is so complete, so absolute, that he can finally afford to be kind. I sat in the passenger seat of my own car, a captive in the custody of my own son, and I watched the predator purr. The road back from the clinic was a masterclass in the theater of condescension, and I was its sole, silent, and appreciative audience. The journey began the moment the office door closed behind us. In the elevator, David was transformed. The tense, worried son who had entered the clinic an hour before was gone, replaced by a man who was light, airy, and visibly relieved. He checked his phone, a small satisfied smile playing on his lips as he scrolled through his messages. He had accomplished his mission. His heavy burden, the troublesome and unpredictable variable of his aging father, had been successfully managed, diagnosed, and was now on a clear and simple path to being permanently filed away. As we walked through the parking lot, his hand on my arm was no longer a gesture of restraint, but one of proud, proprietary ownership. He was guiding his most valuable and most problematic asset. Once we were in the car, his magnanimity bloomed. He turned on the radio, not to the news or talk radio he usually favored, but to a station that played cheerful, inoffensive music from my own youth. It was a gesture he believed was a thoughtful concession to my tastes, but it felt like the programmatic entertainment one might provide for a resident in a memory care facility. He hummed along, his fingers tapping a jaunty rhythm on the steering wheel. He would occasionally glance over at me, his smile wide and full of a profound, heartbreaking pity. He saw a broken old man, a husk, a simpleton who needed to be managed and cared for. He had no idea he was looking at the engineer who had designed the very trap he was now so happily celebrating. My own performance was one of quiet, placid emptiness. I looked out the window, my expression one of mild, childlike interest in the passing scenery. I let my head loll to the side, my eyes half closed, as if the effort of the appointment had utterly exhausted me. I was a blank canvas onto which he could project his own narrative of a successful, if sad, resolution. Inside, however, my mind was a whirlwind of cold, precise calculation. I watched him, and I analyzed his every move. The predator who believes he has won becomes careless. He displays his victory for all to see. David's cheerfulness, his sudden attentiveness, his patronizing kindness, These were not signs of his love, but symptoms of his greed, the joyful effluence of a successful financial transaction. The most extraordinary part of his performance came when we were halfway home. On a sudden, seemingly spontaneous whim, he pulled the car into the parking lot of a brightly colored, old-fashioned ice cream parlor. It was a place he had not taken me to in years, a place we had frequented when he was a boy. He turned to me, his smile impossibly benevolent, and announced we were getting a treat. He led me inside, his hand on my back, and guided me to a small sunlit table. He told me to wait there, as if I were a child who might wander off. I watched him at the counter, a handsome middle-aged man buying an ice cream cone for his senile father. He was the hero of his own story. He returned with 2 cones, one for him, and a simple single scoop of vanilla for me, held in a cone designed for children, with a small paper flange to catch the drips. Before he handed it to me, he took a paper napkin and, with a flourish of performative care, tucked it into the collar of my shirt. The act of infantilization was now complete. He was not just my son, he had become my father, and I, his helpless, simple-minded charge. I accepted the cone with a look of pure, unadulterated delight. I gave it a sloppy, enthusiastic lick, allowing a small drop of vanilla to land on my chin. I played the part, to perfection. I gave him the simple, happy, and utterly dependent father he so desperately needed me to be in that moment, to justify the terrible thing he was doing. The coldness of the ice cream as it touched my tongue felt like the coldness of my own resolve, a sweet, numbing confirmation of the finality of my own plan. We arrived back at my house, the house that would soon, he believed, be his. He walked me to the front door, his duty almost complete. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a final, reassuring pat. He reminded me of the upcoming hearing, his voice low and soothing, framing it as a simple formality, a piece of paperwork that he would handle for me. He was in complete control of a situation he completely misunderstood. I gave him a final vacant smile and a slow, grateful nod. I waited until the sound of his car's engine had completely faded down the street. I stood motionless in my doorway for a full minute, the half-eaten ice cream cone still in my hand, its sticky sweetness beginning to melt over my fingers. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I changed. The slump left my shoulders. The vacant, confused look in my eyes sharpened into a focused, intelligent hardness. My hand, which had trembled so convincingly all day, was now perfectly steady. I looked down at the childish ice cream cone, this symbol of his victory and my humiliation. Then I turned, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it directly into the trash can. The road back was over. The predator had returned his prey to the lair, convinced of his triumph. He did not know that the lair itself was the final, inescapable part of the trap. How quickly can a man's world crumble? Not over years of slow decay, or months of bad decisions, but in a single, silent moment. It crumbles in the time it takes for a trusted ally to change his posture, for a simple truth to be spoken in a quiet room, for a carefully constructed fiction to slam into the granite wall of reality. It crumbles, I discovered, in about 30 seconds. We sat in a small, sterile, and windowless room at the county courthouse, a place designed for bureaucratic proceedings, not high drama. The air was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax. A long, polished table dominated the space, with a stern-faced, black-robed probate judge sitting at its head. On one side sat my son, David, and his lawyer, a man with a tired face and an expensive suit. David looked composed, a portrait of somber responsibility. On the other side sat me, in the drab, simple clothes David had chosen for me, my face a mask of placid confusion, my hands resting limply in my lap. My resurrection was at hand, and I was dressed for my own funeral. David's lawyer began, his voice a smooth, professional drone. He laid out the case with methodical precision. He presented the paperwork from the clinic, the forms my son had so diligently filled out. He recounted the anecdotes David had provided, the spilled coffee, the forgotten names, the plate in the toaster, each one presented as a stepping stone on my sad, inevitable path to incompetence. He spoke of my finances, framing my own money as a danger to me, a temptation for unseen forces that my failing mind could not defend against. He painted a picture of a loving, proactive son, stepping in at a difficult time to protect his father from himself. As he spoke, David would occasionally nod, a sad confirmatory gesture, his eyes downcast. It was a flawless, convincing performance. I sat and listened, a silent spectator at my own trial, and I felt a strange, cold calm. The case against me was a beautiful, intricate machine of lies, and I, the engineer, could not help but admire its construction, even as I prepared to dismantle it completely. When the lawyer had finished, the judge looked over her papers for a moment and then called the sole expert witness. She called for Dr. Robert Marcus. My old friend rose from his seat behind us and walked to the witness chair. He moved with a quiet, unassuming purpose, the walk of a civilian doctor. He was sworn in, his hand steady on the Bible. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the judge, his expression one of professional deference. David's lawyer began his questioning, leading Marcus through the details of my examination. Marcus answered each question with clinical, detached language, confirming his diagnosis of my significant cognitive decline. With every word he spoke, I could see David relax a little more, the final victory now just moments away. Then the judge turned to Marcus. She had a few questions of her own. She asked him how long he had been practicing geriatric medicine, and then she asked a simple, standard question that was not on anyone's script. She asked him if he had any other professional experience that might be relevant to assessing a patient's character and mental state. This was the moment. This was the signal. I watched my friend, and I saw the change. It was a subtle transformation, but for me, who had seen him operate under the most intense pressure imaginable, it was as dramatic as a change in the season. He sat up a little straighter. The gentle, compassionate doctor's mask dissolved, replaced by the calm, authoritative composure of a military officer. The soft edges of his professionalism sharpened into a focused, disciplined hardness. He looked directly at the judge, his voice losing its therapeutic warmth and gaining a new, crisp precision. He stated his name, and then he stated his former rank and serial number. He detailed his 10 years of service as a combat medic and field surgeon. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in this entire charade, he referred to me by my proper title. He stated that for the entirety of his service, he had served in the same unit as Sergeant First Class Frank Miller. I watched my son's face. The confident, sorrowful mask of the dutiful son began to crack. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of confusion appeared in his eyes. This was a variable he had not anticipated. Marcus continued, his voice steady and clear. He recounted his professional opinion of me, not as a patient, but as his sergeant. He described my role as the unit's lead engineer, responsible for keeping life-saving equipment operational under impossible conditions. He spoke of my coolness under fire, my methodical problem-solving skills, my mind, which he described as one of the sharpest and most resilient he had ever encountered. He was resurrecting me, brushstroke by careful brushstroke, painting a portrait of the real Frank Miller for the official court record. Then came the final, devastating blow. He addressed the recent examination. He stated under oath that the cognitive tests he had administered were indeed failed by me, exactly as his report indicated. However, he continued, the entire examination had been conducted at my specific request. It had been, he explained, part of a carefully planned operation, designed with his full cooperation for the express purpose of documenting what I had reason to believe was a fraudulent attempt by my son, David Miller, to seize control of my assets by having me illegally declared incompetent. He then produced a small signed document from his briefcase, a consent form, signed by me a month prior, authorizing the audio recording of the entire medical consultation for legal purposes. The world crumbled. It did not make a sound. It simply ceased to exist. I watched my son's face as the meaning of the doctor's words detonated in the quiet, sterile room. The color drained from his skin, leaving it a sickly, grayish white. His mouth fell open slightly. His eyes, which had been so full of pity and condescension, were now wide with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. His head swiveled slowly from the composed, authoritative figure of Dr. Marcus to me. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in months. And in my eyes, he did not see a confused, senile old man. He saw his father, his mind sharp, his gaze cold, his expression one of quiet, absolute victory. He saw the engineer, the soldier, the strategist. He saw the man who had built the trap he was now caught in. And in that single silent moment of recognition, his world, and everything he thought he knew, turned to dust. Marcus placed a small silver digital recorder on the judge's desk. He had finished his testimony. My resurrection was complete. What is the sound of truth when it finally arrives? It is not a triumphant brass fanfare or the clean, satisfying report of a rifle. It does not announce itself with thunder. The sound of truth, I discovered, is small and tinny. It is the sound of a digital audio file played through a tiny speaker in a quiet, airless room. It is a sterile, passionless echo of a conversation that was, at its heart, a monstrous betrayal. And it is the most devastating sound in the world. The judge, a woman with eyes that had seen every form of human folly, looked at the small silver recorder on her desk, then at my old friend, Dr. Marcus. She gave a single authoritative nod. The time for testimony was over. The time for evidence had begun. Marcus leaned forward and, with a steady, practiced hand, pressed a button. A small green light blinked on, and the room was filled with the faint electronic hiss of an open recording. Then, a voice emerged. A voice I recognized as Marcus's, calm and professional, the sound of him welcoming us into his office a week ago. And then another voice, my own, but not my own. It was the voice of my performance, a thin, reedy, and hesitant sound, the voice of a man lost in a fog of his own confusion. And then, a third voice, clear, confident, and full of a terrible, condescending warmth. My son's voice. The elixir, the pure, undiluted, and poisonous truth, was being administered, drop by drop, into the silent room. I watched my son as he was forced to listen to himself. The recording played on, an audio transcript of his own character's assassination of me. We all listened to him patiently explaining my symptoms to the doctor, the list of my supposed failings delivered in a tone of such profound, counterfeit sorrow. I heard myself in the background, making a small confused sound, a perfectly timed piece of my performance that now, played back, was a chilling indictment of his cruelty. I saw David flinch at the sound of my feigned helplessness. He was being confronted with the stark reality of his own manipulation, a reality he could no longer deny or reframe. The recording continued, moving from the anecdotal evidence to the heart of the matter. We listened to his voice confidently outlining the need for me to be placed in a high-end facility, his words a smooth, logical argument for my swift and total removal from his life. And then came the most damning portion, the discussion of my finances. We listened to his voice, full of a feigned, reluctant sense of duty, explaining to the doctor that my assets needed to be managed and protected. He was a composer, and this was his masterpiece, a symphony of greed played on an instrument of feigned concern. The sound of his own calm, rational voice, laying out his plan to seize control of my life's savings, was the sound that finally broke him. His collapse was a quiet, internal implosion. The color, which had drained from his face at the beginning of the testimony, now returned in a series of dark, mottled red blotches on his neck and cheeks. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. His confident, upright posture dissolved, and he seemed to shrink in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking too large for him. He squeezed his eyes shut, a man trying to block out a sound that was coming not from the speaker, but from the deepest, most undeniable part of his own memory. He was being forced to see himself, not as the noble, long-suffering son, but as a common, calculating thief, and the vision was unbearable. His lawyer, a man paid to be professionally detached, stared at his own legal pad as if it held the secrets to the universe, his face a mask of utter professional horror. He had been made a party to a clear and obvious fraud, his own reputation now caught in the wreckage of his client's greed. The recording played on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, we heard the sound of chairs scraping, of the appointment concluding, of my son's cheerful, relieved voice thanking the doctor for his time. And then, a click and silence. The elixir had been administered. Dr. Marcus reached forward and turned off the device. The silence that filled the room now was different from the one that had preceded the recording. It was a heavy, dead silence, the kind that follows a fatal, unanswerable verdict. It was filled with the ghost of my son's voice, the tinny echo of his lies. The truth had arrived, not as a cleansing fire, but as a cold, clinical poison, and its effects were now absolute. I looked at my son. He was a broken man, a hollowed-out shell. His world, which had been so solid and certain just an hour before, had been completely and irrevocably vaporized. The judge looked at him too, her expression no longer neutral, but filled with a cold, clear, and undisguised contempt. She picked up her wooden gavel, not to strike it, but simply to hold it, its weight a symbol of the authority she was about to wield. The sound of truth, I realized, was the hiss of a tape recorder, the squeak of a lawyer's chair as he shifts in discomfort, and the soft, ragged sound of a grown man's breathing as he is publicly and privately undone. Have you ever seen a man become a ghost right before your eyes? Not in a story or a film, but in the stark, unforgiving light of a small, windowless room. A ghost is not a specter that rattles chains. It is a person from whom all substance, all agency, all meaning has been stripped away, leaving only a hollow, translucent shell of a man. I witnessed this strange and terrible alchemy in the moments that followed the end of the recording. The silence that filled the hearing room was the most profound I had ever experienced. It was the sound of a life being unwritten, of a future being erased. My son David sat frozen in his chair, a statue carved from disbelief. And in that silence, the resolution, swift and merciless, arrived. The judge, a woman who had presided over this hearing with an impassive, almost bored expression, was now a figure of immense and focused power. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech. Her actions were a series of small, precise, and devastatingly final gestures. She took the petition for my incompetence, the document my son had so carefully prepared, and she made a single sharp notation on it with a red pen. Then, with a quiet, contemptuous flick of her wrist, she pushed it to the side of her desk. It was a dismissal, an utter and complete nullification of my son's entire endeavor. The legal weapon he had aimed at my head had been rendered a piece of scrap paper. Next, she pulled the small silver recording device towards her. She looked at it, then at Dr. Marcus, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. She then turned her gaze upon my son's lawyer, who had been staring at his own hands as if he had never seen them before. The judge began to speak, her voice low and even, but each word carried the weight of judicial authority. She was dictating her official recommendation. She recommended that the audio recording, along with Dr. Marcus's testimony and the fraudulent medical forms submitted by my son, be immediately forwarded to the district attorney's office for the initiation of a criminal investigation into conspiracy to commit fraud against a vulnerable adult. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against the fragile shell of my son's composure. He had walked into this room as a petitioner, a concerned son. He would walk out as a potential felon. The lawyer for my side, a quiet, competent man who had been part of our plan from the beginning, then produced a final document and placed it before the judge. It was a petition for a temporary restraining order. The judge read it, her expression unchanging. She picked up her pen, signed the bottom with a firm, decisive stroke, and then stamped it with an official seal. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper was a sharp, percussive crack in the silent room, a sound of final, legal severance. Just like that, a legal wall had been erected between me and my son. He was forbidden from my home, from my life, from my presence. It was during this swift, bureaucratic dismantling of his life that David became a ghost. The color did not return to his face. Instead, he seemed to become translucent, his features losing their definition. He was no longer a participant in the events, but a horrified spectator to his own ruin. His own lawyer subtly shifted his chair a few inches away from him, a small, instinctive act of professional disassociation. The two court officers who had been standing impassively by the door now looked at him with a new, cold interest. He was no longer a civilian in a family dispute. He was a subject of the state, a problem to be managed. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat, his eyes wide and vacant, as the life he had so carefully planned was systematically taken apart and handed over to the cold, impersonal machinery of the law. The judge finally struck her gavel, a single sharp report that officially concluded the hearing. The room began to empty. David's lawyer gathered his papers with frantic, clumsy haste, avoiding any eye contact with his former client. As I watched my son, I felt nothing. Not triumph, not pity, not even the ghost of paternal love. I felt only a profound and empty sorrow. The man across the table was a stranger, a ghost haunted by his own greed. A court officer approached him and, with a quiet but firm gesture, indicated that he should stand. He rose, his movements stiff and robotic, and allowed himself to be led from the room. Soon, only 3 of us remained: me, Dr. Marcus, and my lawyer. The silence that settled now was one of peace, of a battle concluded, of a mission accomplished. Marcus caught my eye. There was no celebration in his gaze. There was only the grim, quiet satisfaction of 2 old soldiers who had done a difficult and ugly, but necessary, job. We had faced the enemy, and we had prevailed, but the victory was a somber one, for the enemy had been my own blood. We stood, and together we walked out of the hearing room and into the long marble hallway of the courthouse. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the empty space. For the first time in months, I walked not with a feigned shuffle, but with the steady, even stride of a free man. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows at the end of the hall was almost blindingly bright. We walked towards it, leaving the shadows and the ghosts behind us. What do you do on the first day of the rest of your life? There is no grand ceremony, no sudden cinematic transformation. The world does not applaud. The first day is quiet. It is a day of small, simple acts of reclamation. It is the day you begin the slow, methodical work of rebuilding your own world, not as it was, but as it was always meant to be. Weeks had passed since the quiet, sterile violence of the hearing room. The legal machinery had turned, its gears grinding with a slow and impersonal finality. My son David was now a subject of the state, his future a bleak landscape of legal battles and public shame. I felt no triumph in this, only a deep and hollow ache, the sorrow of a limb that has been necessarily, but tragically, amputated. The resolution was not his punishment, it was my liberation. My house, which had become a stage for my deception and a potential prison, was a home again. The first thing I did was to reclaim the space. I moved the furniture in the living room, breaking the static, oppressive arrangement that had defined my days of feigned helplessness. The floral armchair, my throne of senility, I moved to a far corner, stripping it of its power. I opened the windows, all of them, and let the crisp autumn air chase out the stale atmosphere of lies and pity. The house could breathe again, and so could I. But my true reclamation took place in the sanctuary, the place I had once been forced to hide, my workshop. It was no longer a refuge. It was now the proud and open heart of my home. My work became my meditation. I had taken on the most complex project I could find, the complete restoration of a 19th century astronomical clock. It was a universe of brass and steel, a breathtakingly intricate machine of hundreds of tiny, interlocking gears and levers designed to map the phases of the moon and the movements of the planets. It was a machine that had fallen silent decades ago, its heart still, its purpose forgotten. And with the patient, steady hands of an engineer and the focused mind of a free man, I was bringing it back to life. I spent my days at my workbench, the familiar clean scent of solvent and machine oil in the air, a pair of magnifying loupes strapped to my head. I cleaned each gear, polished each pinion, calibrated each spring with a precision that was the antithesis of the chaotic, clumsy fool I had pretended to be. This work was a quiet, daily declaration of my own resurrection. It was proof to myself that my mind wasn't just intact, but as sharp and as capable as it had ever been. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, letting himself in through the unlocked back door, as old friends do. Dr. Marcus stood for a moment in the doorway of the workshop, a silent observer to my quiet labor. He was no longer the stern, authoritative witness from the hearing, nor the compassionate, professional actor from the clinic. He was simply Marcus, the young medic I had once known, now inhabiting the body of an old man, just like me. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat, and for a long time we did not speak. He simply watched me work, his presence a comfortable, reassuring weight in the quiet room. The silence between us was not empty. It was full of a shared history, of battles fought together, of a final difficult victory won. There was nothing that needed to be said. We had said it all when it mattered most. After a while, I set down my tweezers and wiped my hands on a clean cloth. I turned to the old wooden cabinet in the corner and took out a bottle of single malt scotch, the good bottle I had been saving for a day I thought might never come, and 2 heavy, crystal glasses. I poured 2 fingers for each of us, the amber liquid catching the golden light of the afternoon sun. I handed a glass to him. We did not toast. We did not speak of my son, or of the hearing, or of the future. We simply raised our glasses in a silent acknowledgement of all of it. It was a soldier's salute, a quiet recognition of a mission accomplished, of a duty honorably discharged. The scotch was warm and smooth, the taste of a hard-won peace. He left as quietly as he had arrived. I sat for a while longer, the warmth of the whiskey still in my chest, and then I turned back to my work. The final piece of the clockwork, a tiny star-shaped gear that governed the lunar phase, was ready. With the steadiest of hands, I lowered it into place. I made the final delicate adjustments, and then I picked up the winding key. I inserted it into the clock and gave it a slow, deliberate turn. There was a soft click, a whir of movement, and then a sound. A steady, rhythmic, and perfectly even ticking. The heart of the small mechanical universe had begun to beat again. I looked at the beautiful, complex face of the clock, at the moon and the stars beginning their slow, majestic dance, and I felt a profound sense of completion. I had taken something broken and made it whole. I had restored order. Time, which my son had tried to steal from me, was now mine once more, measured out in the clean, precise, and hopeful ticking of a life, finally and truly my own.